There's a tribe of American Indians called the Mecca Indians.
Mecca?
The Mecca Indians. And there's no doubt about it. We saw later on, again, reports of Native American Indians who would pray to the West.
So
they bow down in prayer like the Muslims.
For example, the sailors from Morocco, do they were in America?
We'll stick with Africa for now, and we'll move on to these.
They were in America.
We'll stick with Africa first, and then we'll move on to this. We know as well, that there's physical evidence that Muslims were in America before Columbus.
And what is it?
One of the physical evidences is you find writings on rocks. What they would do is they would actually write things into rocks with sharp objects. You'd find the name of Allah, for example. You'd find the name of Allah.
Allah was Arabic.
In Arabic. You'd find certain du'as. There's one du'a, basically I can't remember the exact way, something along the lines of A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, for example. Written on a rock. And this can be carbon dated to the time before Columbus. So we know there were Muslims. Whether they were the ones from West Africa or not, Allah knows best. Now what Sheikh Abdul Hakim Quick talked about is he proved how they could make it to the Americas. If you look at the currents going across the Atlantic, it shows how their boats could have easily made it to the Americas. The problem was talking about how they got back. Because, it suggested that they made it back. And I remember he was saying once, he was actually sitting down with some historians from one of the universities in Canada, and they said, we've got no problem agreeing that the Muslims made it. The West African Muslims made it to America. Got no problem with this.
But maybe they not go back.
Yes, they say, how do you prove that they got back? And he says, this is what I can't prove. You've got physical evidence there were Muslims there. Whether it was the West Africans or not, we don't know. We know in Al-Andalus, it was very famous, a story about a group of explorers who went from Andalus and they sailed to the west and they came to a new land. And they dealt with the people, they traded with them, and they made it back. This is a well-known story in Andalus. And going by the descriptions of what they're talking about, it had to be the Americas. Whether it be North or South America, Allah knows best. Some say they would have reached, for example, Brazil. Could have been, the Caribbean, could have been North America. But this story was well known.
We have one more indicator, the maps from Colombo. He take the Arab maps. Why? Maybe we say that maybe he knew that they maybe have the America in that maps or some way to India.
Yeah, without doubt. Now we see further than this. There was a book that was written by a historian's name, Gavin Menzies, and it's called 1421, the year the Chinese discovered America. Sorry, the year that China discovered America. So this is going 70 years before Columbus. Now it was known that the Chinese had maps that clearly showed North America. Clearly showed. From around the time of Columbus, they had these maps. And as we know, we talked about him when we were looking at Islam in China. You had the Chinese Muslim general, Zheng He.
Maybe he made it there and he give for them Islam.
This is a possibility, but we know that Zheng He, if he came from China, he would have come to the west coast of America. But we know, along with this, if he made it to the west coast, we know there were also Muslims on the eastern coast. This is where Cuba is. So it could have been that Muslims made it to the east coast of America and the west coast of America. As said Zheng He had these maps. The Yuan dynasty, they had maps clearly showing America. There's no doubt about it. When you look at this, you're sure.
Before
Columbus. We're talking 70 years before Columbus. So you see that there are many evidences showing that the Muslims would have made it before. You've got physical evidence, and you find that this creates a lot of controversy. As we were looking when we were talking about the history of Islam in Australia, when you prove there were Muslims before the Europeans, you're redefining the history of your land. When you legitimize the history of Islam in your country, that Muslims were there long before. They found it before Columbus, the European, discovered it. This changes the way that you think about the country.
You are losing the ability to ban some things, to ban azan, to ban some maybe the wearings of Islam like hijab.
Exactly. And if you wanted to come to a Native American Indian in the USA and deprive him of his rights, he'll say, no, I'm a native of this land. You can't oppress me. And they're going to be a lot more careful with the Native American Indian because he was there before you. You've got to show him some respect. And we know there were Muslims before that. So it's going to change the psyche of the people. And you find that there were some books that were actually written showing the evidence that there were Muslims in the USA. And some of these books had to be protected in the libraries.
And these books written by Americans?
By Americans.
By Americans.
There's a book, I think also Quest America. In this book, it was on display, I think it was in the Boston Library. It had to be protected by security guards because so many people would try to destroy this book, wanting to destroy the evidence of Muslims in America. And this is why, as we were saying in our introductory episode, history becomes a political tool. The moment you can prove there were Muslims in America before Columbus, it's going to change the way that people are going to think. So people want to cover this up. But alhamdulillah, now, especially in the age of the internet, technology, more than ever, you can't hide these things anymore. The people, they know about this. It's accepted. Columbus was not the first person to make it to the Americas.
I guess that would just change, Americans saying it was found on Christian values, when they talk about Abraham Lincoln and basically all those things, if Muslims did actually go there first, that would be just a total change.
It's going to change everything. And we are actually going to talk about this later on, inshallah, about the forefathers of the USA and their religious views and the role that Islam actually played in this. Now, after this, the possible involvement of West Africans or Andalusi Muslims or Chinese Muslims in the Americas, we're going to fast forward to the slave trade. Now, as many of us will know, I think anyone who knows a little bit about the history of America, you've heard about slavery. What would happen is the Europeans, the British, the Americans, they'd basically sail into West Africa, attack and take as many slaves as they could, take them back to America and sell them as slaves. And they'd be forced to work on the cotton plantations, be forced to, work in their houses to look after their people. And the history of slavery is well known in the USA.
And the U.S. is like one of the first things you learn about.
Yeah, the US is a prime example of this. And it's said that 1/3 of the slaves were Muslims. We know for sure that many of these slaves were Muslims.
All the slaves coming from Africa.
The vast majority of them, at least 99% of them were from Africa, especially from West Africa. So we know around West Africa you had the Mandinga Empire. You had, many, many Muslim empires at this time.
Mali, you have I think Borno, something like this. In Ghana, you have this, and some of these Muslims was as scholars.
Yes,
So,
and
yes.
this is what we're going to see in a moment.
It's actually pretty interesting about. I was actually listening to someone. He said basically when the slaves came and the owners would tell them to do stuff. Their reply would be like "okay," and basically "okay" is a word that is used till today in the English language.
This is a folk etymology, and it's one of the suggestions for this. It's if we've got time to look at the etymology of words, I'd love to have a show just about this. I don't know if it will be as interesting as the history though. But this is one of the ways where they say it's possible the word "okay" was taken from the slaves.
This means slaves who built the bases of America.
Yeah, they were the workers. They were the workers who worked for free basically. They were never paid for their work. Now we see there's a very famous series. It was called Roots. Roots was a very, very famous series that was made in the USA, and it talks about the history of African Americans. Now Roots, I'm sure you've heard of O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was actually in Roots. Check it out. It's a very interesting series, and it focuses on there's a character. His name's Kunta Kinte. Kunta Kinte is a slave. He's taken from Africa, and you see he's a Muslim.
He was Muslim.
He's a Muslim. This is it's not a completely factual story, but it was inspired by true events. And we know, as we said, many of them are Muslims. And you see that even O.J. Simpson, he plays a Muslim in this, and they greet each other by saying, "Peace be upon you, Assalamu alaikum." So you see this in Roots. It shows the history of this family, how they came as Muslims, but eventually their religion was taken away. By the third generation, they weren't Muslims anymore. Once you're a slave, it's like your soul is taken away to a large extent. You had slavery that took place in some areas of the world where it was, you could call it a benevolent type of slavery. Well, the slaves were really given a better life to some degrees. The slavery in the USA, however, it was complete opposite. The slaves suffered. Their religion was taken away. Things were very difficult for them, to survive at this time. Now, it's well known that many of these slaves spoke Arabic. For example, there was one American, he actually spent a lot of time in Turkey. And in Turkey, he learned to speak the Arabic language. And so when he was in the USA, he actually heard a lot of these slaves speaking. And he heard them speaking Arabic. So he actually spoke with them. And he sat down with some of them, asking them about their history. Some of them would say, I was an alim, my father was an alim, he was a scholar, and his father was a scholar. Scholars of Maliki fiqh, of the Maliki madhab. You know, knowing their genealogy. And some of them were, you know, princes, and now they're slaves. And they're relating their history. And you say, as we said, you know, about 1/3 of these slaves were Muslims.
Because, for example, in Timbuktu, it was the big capital.
In
of
which, sorry?
Islam. The Timbuktu in Mali, it was a big capital. And
Yeah,
they
Timbuktu is very, very well known as the
took
center of
slaves from
Islam.
Timbuktu.
No. So what we're going to do, we've got to the point of slavery, which has got, you know, many interesting things to come. We're going to go for a very short break. So dear viewers, do stay tuned. We'll be back with you in a very short moment.
Our legacy. Our legacy.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to your viewers. We're here looking at Islamic history with a focus today on the history of Islam in the Americas. So we've got to the slave trade. You know, we've established that historians have acknowledged that up to 1/3 of the slaves who were taken from Africa to the Americas were Muslims. Many of them they spoke Arabic. You found many of them actually had memorized the entire Quran, and some of them.
Excuse me, you said that some of them are princes or something like that. Didn't their families or Muslim kings didn't know that there are princes and
Of course they
families
knew. Some of them were the kings. They were taken. You know, they were made slaves.
Yeah.
This is something amazing. You know, a king, now he's a slave. the
I
next day.
mean, why didn't the Muslim
Help them.
help them
How-
and give them back?
If you're a Muslim in West Africa, you don't have the capability to sail to America.
Mm.
So what you actually found happening was the Muslims in the Americas trying to defend themselves and actually to get back. And some of them did make it back, which we'll discuss in a moment, inshallah.
Yeah.
And what about the natives? The natives of the Americans.
The natives?
Natives, American natives. The
They were-
Indians. What
I
they
think
say
you're talking about
about
red
Indians? They not do. They do nothing.
With the slaves, you mean?
Not slaves. The you know the British come. Not British. The
Columbus. and-
Columbus come and they bring the slaves.
Mm.
And what about the natives?
The
What they
Native
do with them?
Americans, unfortunately for the most part, they were, like we saw the Aborigines in Australia, they were very oppressed. And there was a big slaughter that was made. A lot of them were killed, you know, their rights were taken away. And you actually find cases where they actually gave them blankets. They would come to them and say, have these blankets to keep you warm. And they'd actually have smallpox on these blankets. So they'd infect these blankets with smallpox, a disease. Then they'd give them these blankets, and it caused, you know, thousands of them to die.
Also, another way that a lot of them got wiped out. I remember you were talking about in the episode about Australia, about the Aborigines. You know how alcohol, they were affected by alcohol. Basically, a lot of the, you know, Europeans brought alcohol in trade for like furs from the natives, so alcohol was a big problem for them too in America.
Especially when you haven't been accustomed to this, and you're using this addictive drug, it can really ruin your life. So unfortunately, the Native Americans, you know, things were not good for them after Columbus, unfortunately. So now we see, as we were saying, you had many of the African American slaves were very educated. One of them, he actually wrote the whole Quran. Once he became freed, towards the end of his life, he wrote the whole Quran by memory, with only a few mistakes. You can actually see it today. He wrote the whole Quran from memory.
Really, where can you see this?
It's available in some museums in the USA. You had some who actually wrote books of fiqh. He's in the USA writing books
USA,
of
From
fiqh.
memory.
he-
From memory.